that I'm a geologist, so I think in terms of long time periods in part, and it's very clear that the Earth has undergone different geomagnetic environments over time, and part of that is tied to the galactic center. When we say geomagnetic, we're not talking about just the magnetic field emanating from the center of the Earth. That is affected by everything from the solar cycle, sunspot cycle. It's affected by our alignment to the galactic center. It's affected by our relative position to the other planets in our solar system, to other stars around us, to where we are in the Milky Way. And this has had a tremendous effect on Earth over time. A lot of people will simply dismiss this as being too subtle to have affected consciousness or to affect life. What we're finding now in very rigorous studies is that what referred to as very subtle electromagnetic fields affect our mental abilities, affect our conscious states.
And it can go either way, right?
And it can go either way. Absolutely, it can go either way. Getting back to what I was talking about, even with the geomagnetic studies, fluxes in the geomagnetic field correlate not with simply heightened abilities in some cases, increased ability, for instance, to remote view, in some cases up to a factor of 10 or more, but it also correlates, for instance, with poltergeist instances.
Interesting.
And poltergeist instances, we haven't talked about that yet, but that's another topic which I have become convinced in part by witnessing one myself that I'm sure was absolutely not faked. It was spontaneous. It was real. Poltergeist instances are not necessarily positive, should we say.
Can you share with us some of the details of your experience?
Yeah, I was in a situation where it was actually a very typical poltergeist instance in the sense that it was with a person who was emotionally worked up, should we say, upset about certain things, etc., and actually something came up in conversation that sparked, what should we say, emotional outburst, but not a physical anything. And then next thing you know, things are falling off the shelf, a book in particular with a topic that was related to the subject at hand.
Wow.
And I saw it directly come off, and I'm telling you, it did not fall off because of gravity. No one was close to it. Nothing shook. It was essentially, I'm convinced it occurred. But
wow.
most poltergeist instances, as I've studied them, are focused on an individual who usually has some kind of emotional issues they're working through. And essentially, if you want to think about it, psychic energy being thrown off and affecting material objects around. In some cases, it can cause noises. In some cases, it causes things to fly off shelves or, things to break, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it kind of goes to that adage they have in positive thinking circles that thoughts are things, energies.
Absolutely.
Motion is energy.
And we include in the book an article by William Roll on poltergeist. He's probably the foremost authority in the 20th century, and he points out, for instance, and consistently in studies of real poltergeist phenomena, because there's absolutely fraud too. People, like to attract attention to themselves in some cases and get a movie made about themselves, even if it's not real. But in real cases, for instance, it's typical that the size and mass of objects that are affected drops off with the distance from the person who seems to be the center of the poltergeist, which is what you would expect from a natural science point of view. If it's some kind of energy emanating from them, that objects closer will be affected, with more likelihood than further objects. Objects with, it correlates with their mass, etc. And again, these are the types of patterns that I find very convincing that the phenomenon's real.
Mm-hmm. Robert, we've just got a few minutes left. What's next on your horizon?
Oh, well, I'm continuing to pursue these topics. I mean, for a long time, I have to admit that for a long time I was interested in the paranormal and parapsychology before I should we say, came out and started talking about it publicly, but there's no turning back at this point. So I'm continuing to pursue it. Something that's of great interest to me, and I am working on, is essentially trying to develop a theory or a more comprehensive hypothesis, should we say, that would account for paranormal phenomena.
What are you calling it?
Well, I haven't got a good name for it.
We haven't got the hook yet.
But I'm working on it. I've got to get the hook. But see, I think to me this is very important. This is actually one of the major criticisms among the skeptics, is that there's no good encompassing theory to explain them, so they simply want to dismiss them. Again, as I used the analogy before, continental drift was rejected until there was a good theory to explain it. So that's something that fascinates me, and I have to admit I'm working on it at the moment.
Wonderful. Well, as I said earlier, you're like the perfect bridge because you're so multidisciplinary and you have boots-on-the-ground experience as well as the actual academic background to be able to support it.
Well, thank you.
Just one more question about Egypt. Where are we going with Egypt? Is there going to be any movement on acceptance of a earlier date for the Sphinx?
Actually, I think there is movement. I mean, it's got into a situation where a lot of the critics have, how should I say, I believe they are not as vociferous as they used to be. They're not as vocal as they used to be. I haven't been called as many names recently. And part of it is that the data has stood up. It's stood the test of time, and other geologists that have gone over there have confirmed it. That's one aspect. The second aspect is that we are now finding more and more evidence for sophisticated cultures going back much earlier than the conventional archaeologists have claimed they should. When I first got involved in the Egypt and the redating of the Sphinx, that was the early 90s. That was almost 20 years ago now. And it was sort of in a vacuum that the Sphinx could be so ancient. Now, for instance, we have sites in Turkey where you've got large-scale megalithic structures that have been dated to the same period. In Egypt itself, we have more work, for instance, down in southern Egypt, coming from the same period. There's evidence from England, the Stonehenge area, etc. So what was once isolated, it's harder and harder to dismiss when you're getting all this other evidence showing that, in fact, at that very remote period, there was more happening than conventional archaeology ever admitted.
Well, now if we can just get those stones to speak a little bit louder, perhaps by amping up our own abilities, we might be able to learn something.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's another of the goals.
Well, Robert, it's been a true pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, and best of luck in all your future endeavors. We'll look forward to that theory of everything on our paranormal abilities.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Once again, Dr. Robert Schoch. The book is The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
You're listening to Dreamland's unique blend of information and ideas.
A person has a close encounter experience, and then afterwards something very odd happens. A stranger shows up, human-looking but perhaps alien, who has detailed knowledge about the eyewitness's life or future. Well, now one such witness has been talking to somebody we all know and love, Linda Moulton Howe, Dreamland's ace science reporter. She brings you the facts that others dare not even speak about. Her website, earthfiles.com. Don't miss a single day of this Emmy Award winner's marvelous website. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, Whitley. As a professional journalist, I know that men and women who work in police departments and sheriff's offices are often exposed to many high strangeness events that are never reported to the public. I know that firsthand from those in law enforcement who told me they had come to the conclusion as far back as the 1970s that the perpetrators of worldwide animal mutilations, to use their words, was being caused by creatures from outer space, unquote. But most